Back to some domestic policy. Low rates of home ownership amongst young adults are an issue really high on the political agenda. I'm going to talk about barriers to home ownership for young adults and potential policy responses. But let's start with house prices. So house prices have increased enormously over the last 20 years, even after accounting for inflation. So the average house price in England in today's money went from £87,000 in 1997 to £234,000 in 2017, and that's an increase of 173%. Prices have grown particularly quickly in London, and to a lesser extent in the southeast, east of England, and southwest. Price growth has been slightly slower in other regions and broadly flat since 2008, but the key takeaway is that across the country, house prices are now much higher than they were 20 years ago. Over the same time period, the proportion of young adults aged 25 to 34 in the UK that own their own home fell from 55 to 35%. Now, that fall has happened across the country, and it's been much bigger for young adults than for any older age group. So if we take that 20 percentage point fall for 25 to 34-year-olds, that compares to a 13 percentage point drop for 35 to 44-year-olds, who are the second most affected age group. What you can't see is from this graph is that for some age groups, actually home ownership has increased over this period. So there are clearly some implications of these trends for inequality between older and younger generations. Right. Now, there are also big inequalities in home ownership within the younger generation. So this graph shows home ownership rates for young adults, splitting them into 5 groups based on their income. So we have the lowest income young adults on the left and the highest income young adults on the right. What you can see is that in 1997, 86% of the highest income young adults owned their own home, compared to 18% of the lowest income young adults. Since then, home ownership has fallen across the income distribution for young adults, but the biggest falls have been for middle income young adults. Now, whilst in the past, 2/3 of them own their own home, now only a quarter do. So I've just shown you big increases in house prices and big falls in home ownership. Perhaps unsurprisingly, these two things are related, and indeed previous research has confirmed that almost all of the falls in home ownership amongst this younger group can be explained by increases in house prices relative to incomes. So what we wanted to do in this chapter was to try and understand better the mechanisms by which higher house prices lead to barriers to home ownership for young adults. To do that, we looked at the 2 key barriers that young adults face when trying to buy a home. The first is saving for a deposit. So most of the time, you already need to have saved up at least 10% of the value of the property that you'd like to buy. The second, after you've saved for a deposit, is borrowing enough to cover the rest. Most of the time, your ability to do this depends on how much you earn, as typically it's difficult to get a mortgage for more than 4.5 times your salary. Now, what I'm going to show you over the next few slides is that both of these barriers have increased for young adults over the last 20 years as a result of rising house prices. Let's start with deposits. So what this is going to show you is the proportion of young adults for whom a 10% deposit on a home in their area is equivalent to more than 6 months of their net annual income. So in 1996, for a third of young adults, a 10% deposit on a home on the average property in their area would have meant saving up more than half their annual income. By 2016, this had increased to 78% of young adults. Now, if we consider a cheaper home in their local area, so one that costs less than 90% of other homes, you see that still in 2016, almost half of young adults would need to save almost more than half their annual income for a 10% deposit on one of these cheapest properties in their area, up from just 1 in 10 in 1996. What this tells us is that regardless of whether young adults want to buy the average home in their area or really one of the cheapest homes in their area, it's become much more difficult to save for a deposit over the last 20 years. Let's look at the second barrier. Imagine that all young adults in England already have a 10% deposit and they can borrow 4.5 times their salary. Now, what this is going to show you is the proportion of young adults for whom that gives them enough money to buy a home in their area. So in 1996, 83% of young adults, if they had a 10% deposit and they borrowed 4.5 times their salary, could buy the average home in their local area. And by 2016, this had fallen to just a third of young adults. By borrowing that same amount, in 1996, almost all young adults who were in work could have bought one of the cheapest homes in their local area. By 2016, this had fallen to just 61% of young adults. So this graph is really stark. This tells us that if borrowing conditions 20 years ago were what they are now, home ownership would have been accessible to almost all young adults in work. And now that's only true for 61% of young adults. Let's look at how this varies regionally. So I'm going to take that grey line and I'm going to show it to you again as a bar chart. So here's the number for 1996, 2006, and 2016. Now, in 1996, there was very little regional variation in access to home ownership on this measure. So those two numbers for London and the surrounding areas and the rest of England are basically the same. Between 1996 and 2006, as house prices rose everywhere, it became much more difficult for young people across the country to borrow enough to buy. Between 2006 and 2016, it continued to get harder for young adults in London, the South East, and East of England to borrow enough to buy a home. But actually, in the rest of England, it's become slightly easier to get on the property market. So what this and the previous figure tells us is that barriers to home ownership are not just about deposits. Even if they had a 10% deposit, a lot of young adults may struggle to buy a home because of restrictions on how much they can borrow relative to their earnings. And this is particularly stark in London and the South East. So, given that high house prices, as I've shown you, create barriers to home ownership for young adults, what are the potential policy options for policymakers that care about this? The first thing that they could potentially do is to put fewer restrictions on mortgage lending. The thing is that there are very good reasons not to do this, not least because these restrictions are in place to protect financial stability. So it would be wise not to remove these restrictions when there are other policy options on the table. A second option that the government has turned to in recent years is the idea of giving young, first-time buyers a financial advantage in the market. Examples of this sort of policy include recent cuts to stamp duty, the lifetime ISA, and Help to Buy. Now, to the extent that these policies reduce the cost to young adults of buying a home, they could increase home ownership for this group, but they may also push up house prices on average. A third option that the government has also looked to recently is disadvantaging other buyers in the housing market, in particular those that look to buy a second home or a property to let out on the private rental market. Worth noting that those are two groups that are likely to be older on average than your typical first-time buyer. Examples of this sort of policy include restrictions on mortgage interest tax relief on buy-to-let properties and the recent stamp duty surcharge on second homes. Now, by increasing the cost of owning multiple properties, these policies could reduce demand for housing and put downwards pressure on prices. However, to the extent that they increase costs for landlords, these might be passed on to tenants in the private rental market. So all of these three sort of options that I've talked about so far try to influence demand for housing, either by making it easier for young adults to buy at a given price, or by reducing demand for housing from other groups. Now, an alternative way of trying to approach this problem is to try and bring down the overall level of prices relative to incomes. And the key to doing that is increasing supply and the responsiveness of supply to demand. There are three broad approaches that the government could take to increasing supply. The first is to directly fund the construction of new homes. Historically, this has mostly been done through funding for social housing. Now, both building more homes for shared ownership or for social rent have the potential to increase home ownership. In the latter case, that's by putting downward pressure on rents in the private rental market. However, if these homes are built on land that might otherwise have been used for private development, some of those positive effects on home ownership might be somewhat mitigated. The second broad approach they could take is to try and loosen planning restrictions that inhibit development. Now, clearly, there are very good reasons to have some restrictions on planning. In the absence of planning restrictions, the private market might not provide public goods like parks or pay sufficient attention to environmental concerns. However, planning restrictions clearly come at a cost. So recent research has found that house prices in the southeast of England could have been 25% lower if planning restrictions there were loosened to match those in the northeast, which has been the region of England with the most permissive planning authorities. Those effects might sound very big, but there are very large planning constraints, not least the Green Belt, which covers 13% of England, which is more than the total amount of land in England that's built on. And it also happens to be surrounding some of the most productive areas of the country where housing demand is highest. Now, it's true that there have recently been lots of reforms to the planning system. However, it's still worth noting that the system fundamentally operates on a case-by-case basis, which increases uncertainty and costs for developers. Now, a final option that the government could consider and that they've been doing a lot in this area, is to try and address other barriers that inhibit development. The government's doing a lot in this area, for example, providing credit to small construction companies and funding for infrastructure to make new housing developments viable. Really, the effectiveness of these policies are going to depend on, firstly, how important these barriers actually are in preventing new development, but also in how well the government's able to identify them and how effective their proposed solutions are. To conclude, house prices have increased enormously over the last 20 years, resulting in increased barriers to home ownership for young adults and a falling proportion of young adults that own their own home. Most of these effects happened before 2007, and it's actually only got harder to buy for young adults since then in London and the surrounding areas. What these trends have done is they have increased inequalities between older and younger generations and within the younger generation. Ultimately, the way to increase access to home ownership is through bringing down the overall level of house prices relative to incomes. And the key to doing that is enabling more homes to be built in the places that people want to live. Currently, we have a system where the barriers to construction are biggest in the areas where housing demand is highest. This creates a geographical mismatch between supply and demand that has implications beyond home ownership and house prices. It affects economic productivity, the time we spend commuting, and inequality in access to job opportunities, all of which the government should consider when coming up with its approach to intervention in the housing market. Thanks, and I'm going to hand over to Agnes.